I'd like to tell you a story about the Golden Age Prince. The Golden Age Prince. In November 1572, a star flashed out of the constellation Cassiopeia, startling the world. Brighter than Venus, it was clearly visible even in the light of day. Many who saw it reported that this guest star, as the comet was called, had a remarkable similarity to the luminous star that guided the Magi, the Bethlehem star. Its coming amazed the world. But while astronomers were baffled by its appearance, the great Swiss mystic physician Paracelsus had prophesied the coming of the special star more than a century earlier, calling it a harbinger of a great renovation of society. There is nothing concealed that will not be revealed, he said. The comet will announce the presence of a marvelous being who as yet lives not, but who will reveal many things. This marvelous being would be a master of all arts and would come bringing 3 treasures for mankind, gifts that would change the face of the world. This prophecy by Paracelsus, delivered in the 15th century, foretelling a renovation of society, came at an unlikely time. For even into the 16th century, men neither knew nor desired to know more than was to be learned from Aristotle, a strange thing at any time. Learning had practically come to a standstill, and scientific experimentation was virtually non-existent, except in the alchemical laboratories of the mystics. But with the sudden appearance of the comet in Cassiopeia in 1572, Europe exploded with geniuses. Historian Alfred North Whitehead, in his book, Science and the Modern World, has referred to a ferment of ideas which were initiated with the sudden intellectual revolution of the 16th century, which he says bequeathed formed systems of thought touching every aspect of human life. It is the one century which consistently and throughout the whole range of human activities provided intellectual genius adequate for the greatness of its occasions. The crowded stage of this 100 years is indicated by the coincidences which mark its literary annals. One of the interesting coincidences of that century was that the coming of this star, harbinger of the Great Revolution, coincided exactly with the dawning of a century of genius in science and literature, which Whitehead clearly believes was initiated by the greatest of mankind, Sir Francis Bacon of England. Francis was 12 years old when the comet dawned. He had reached the age of responsibility. Historians all agree that he had a profound impact on his time, and many believe that this child was the marvelous being foretold by Paracelsus. According to James Stephens, author of Francis Bacon and the Style of Science, Bacon enjoyed drawing overt comparisons between himself and Christ. He saw the obstacles to his success in terms of those which Christ faced, and he was not embarrassed to call the work of the new scientist a second scripture. Francis Bacon's life has been surrounded with mystery since he first breathed the air of the Holy Spirit on January 22nd, 1561. Traditional historians have recorded that Francis, the son of Sir Nicholas and Lady Anne Bacon. His amazing genius has been attributed to the genes of these two, also very exceptional people. The following account has been pieced together from the standard biography of Francis Bacon by James Speeding, as well as numerous biographies which concentrate on the coded ciphers contained in his work. Given the materials available today, the story reflects a secret inner life of the greatest genius of our modern era. During the reign of Queen Mary I, Princess Elizabeth, later Queen Elizabeth I of England, was imprisoned in the Tower. While there, she became acquainted with Robert Dudley, later known as the Earl of Leicester. A violent affection sprang to life between them. Elizabeth maintained the attachment upon their subsequent release from prison, even as she ascended the throne. Her first act upon becoming queen was to appoint young Robert Dudley her Master of the Horse, and then to crown him Earl of Leicester. On the occasion of his investiture at Westminster, we read how she helped him to put on his robes, he sitting on his knees before her and keeping a great gravity and discreet behavior. She could not refrain from putting her hand in his neck to tickle him. A charmingly domestic scene. During the early years of her reign, the two were inseparable. He played the Antony to her Cleopatra and was well hated by the nobility in consequence. She gave him all the honors he wanted. She poured wealth upon him and put power into his hands. That she loved him passionately, no one could doubt. As fate would have it, Elizabeth soon became a mother. As her pregnancy progressed, she married Dudley in a secret ceremony at the house of Lord Pickering. 3 weeks earlier, Robert's wife, Anne Robsart, had met with a so-called fatal accident. 4 months later, Francis was born. The young prince's premature birth, just 4 months after his parents' marriage, prevented the queen from acknowledging him as her son. Her honor was involved. For state reasons, she could not make her marriage public, and so she continued to pose as the Virgin Queen, even while enjoying a marital relationship as wife and mother. The true lineage of the prince became a state secret, although members of the court all knew it and the common people suspected it. It became a criminal offense to mention the affair. It was certain death or mutilation to speak slander of the Virgin Queen. Mistress Anne Dow of Brentwood gossiped that the queen had given birth. She was burnt. Robert Brooks of Devizes was sent to prison for reviving the report. And in 1570, Mr. Marsham, a gentleman of Norfolk, had his ears cut off for having said, "My Lord of Leicester had 2 children by the Queen." When Francis was born, Elizabeth's chief lady-in-waiting was Anne Bacon, the wife of Sir Nicholas Bacon, the Lord Keeper of England. Anne, who had been raised with the Queen, had maintained a good relationship with her. It was she who pleaded with the Queen to spare the life of the child at his birth, offering to raise him herself if the Queen would provide for his support. After some discussion, the Queen agreed, and Lady Anne took the tiny child home that same day in a little round painted box. Anne had been expecting a child herself. It would have been easy for her to announce the birth of twins. But when Anne's baby was born dead a week later, the switch was made and the new little baby boy was introduced to the world. Lady Anne was known through all of England as a deeply religious woman whose accomplishments were many and varied. She was familiar with classical and modern languages. In fact, she was known throughout Europe for her translations from Latin and Italian. We know that Francis loved her passionately, calling her God's own saint, and that even in his middle years he continually returned home so that Anne could care for him. Sir Nicholas, the Lord Keeper of England, was also a writer who reveled in the classics. He was known throughout Europe as an expert in the making and breaking of coded ciphers for the court of Elizabeth I. Francis was not cut out of the common mold. From the beginning, he showed touches of genius. His natural talents were enhanced by an education fit for a king. The Queen demanded that he receive the same caliber education as she. Hers was thought to have been the finest training in the world. We see him in these early days a man amongst boys. As a child, Francis was remarkable for his precocity in the absorption of knowledge. People were afraid to put him off with old wives' tales for fear of the shower of subtle questions that would descend. "Oh, I don't know what to teach Master Francis," retorted his tutor, Mr. Cotwin. "He learns too fast. His brain catches fire at a word. He plies me with questions I can't answer, like what is the cause of an echo?" It seems Mr. Cotwin had his hands full keeping up with the most exquisitely constructed brain ever given to the sons of man. Alfred Dodd, noted English historian and loyal devotee of Francis Bacon, enlarged on this observation. If ever there was a man born for power, a man on whom there shone a beam of God's splendor from cradle to grave, a man sent out from the world unseen to do great things, to recreate England, the continent, the world, born to set it right, that man was Francis Bacon. In Francis Bacon, the desire for life was strong and deep. It took the form of a longing to know and to understand. His mind ripened astonishingly early. He turned eagerly to books and devoured their contents as a starving child wolfs a crust. He learned his Latin grammar from the compendium. The little book with the boy's scribble and drawings in the margin is still in existence. He read almost all of the writers of Greece and Rome. He read the Fathers, Augustine, Origen, Saint Jerome, and Clement. And for diversion he read the novelists of Italy and the witty satires of Erasmus. By the time Francis had reached the age of 12, noted David Lloyd, the 17th century writer on statesmen and favorites of Queen Elizabeth, his star had appeared. His great fixed and methodical memory, his quick fancy, his ready expression gave assurance of that profound and universal comprehension of things which rendered him the observation of the great and wise. It was at this time that Bacon took his vow to be a servant to prosperity. When he was 12 years old, Francis wrote a play and took it to Mr. Cotwin. The play was in Latin and smacked strongly of Plautus. It was called Rex Philosophus, the Philosopher King. While his mother objected to drama altogether, she felt that play acting was wicked, an invitation of the devil to trap souls. But the Greeks were heathens and their acting of plays didn't matter because they were doomed poor souls to go to hell anyway. Mr. Cotwin knew that the Queen was fond of children and always delighted when they offered her pretty little speeches in priest's Latin, and Francis was quite obviously her favorite. Mr. Cotwin's efforts were not in vain. Her Majesty the Queen was consulted as to whether Her Highness would of her infinite graciousness and never to be too much praised benevolence be present at a little masque written by Master Francis Bacon and acted by him, assisted by his little cousins and friends. Her Majesty vouchsafed a gracious answer and, turning to my Lord of Leicester, reminded him of his interest in the theatre. A fortnight later, on a warm afternoon in June, freshened by a breeze from the river, the Queen and Leicester and Lord Burleigh and his lady and many other members of the nobility were gathered in the shady gardens of York House to see a little masque called Rex Philosophus, acted by Master Anthony and Master Francis Bacon, assisted by Mistress Betty Cecil, Master Robert Cecil, and sundry little Arundels and Pembrokes, and stage managed by Mr. Edward Cotwin, M.A., and Mr. John Cosgrove of Lord Leicester's company of players. The stage was the green lawn that spread like a thick carpet between the wings of the long two-storied house, with its prick-eared gables and tall chimney stacks. A massive oak seat spread with rugs served as a throne for the Queen. Lord Leicester and the Earl of Pembroke stood on either side of her. Francis was the Philosopher King, splendid in his little suit of scarlet and cloth of gold, with large pink roses on his pointed shoes. It was the first time he had taken part in a real masque with grown-ups for audience, and at first his voice was rather low. But when Mr. Cotwin from behind the laurel bushes shouted in a stage whisper, "Louder, louder!" the philosopher king sprang as it were to life. His words were spoken with clear enunciation, rising at times to an urgency of passion, strange in a child so young. All whispers died, all eyes were fixed upon him. Quote, "And I say to you, great kings and princes, be philosophers, and to you, philosopher, I say, be kings, kings of yourselves, and so will you lead all men captive. For the king who knows not his own heart will never read the hearts of his subjects, and the philosopher who lives only in his mind, forever turning this problem and that, will never find the key of escape, climb the golden tree, or gather the apples of the Hesperides." End of quote. These are the words written by Francis Bacon in his play at the age of 12. At the same age, he was sent to Cambridge and entered with his brother Anthony as fellow commoner of Trinity College. There he hoped he would learn all that men knew. For to his way of thinking, ignorance is the curse of God, knowledge the wings whereby we fly to heaven. Francis soon found, however, that he could not get to heaven from Cambridge. Ideals soon gave way to reality as he pursued his studies. In a very often quoted passage, Bacon's biographer recounts the determination of Francis on the occasion of his entering into his 12th year. Quote, "It was then that a thought struck him, the date of which deserves to be recorded, not for anything extraordinary in the thought itself, which had perhaps occurred to others before him, but for its influence upon his afterlife. If our study of nature be thus barren, he thought, our method of study must be wrong. Might not a better method be found?" The suggestion was simple and obvious, and the singularity was in the way he took hold of it. With most men, such a thought would have come and gone in a passing regret. But with him, the gift of seeing in prophetic vision what might be and ought to be was united with the practical talent of devising means and handling minute details. He could at once imagine like a poet and execute like a clerk of the works. Upon the conviction, this may be done, followed at once the question, how may it be done? Upon that question answered, followed the resolution to try to do it. End of his biographer's quote. Observe that the subject of this paragraph is a little boy 12 years old. The biographer continues, "Of the degrees by which the suggestion ripened into a project, the project into an undertaking, and the undertaking unfolded itself into distinct proportions and the full grandeur of its total dimensions, I can say nothing. But that the thought first occurred to him at Cambridge, therefore before he had completed his 15th year, we know upon the best authority, his own statement to Dr. Raleigh. I believe it ought to be regarded as the most important event of his life, the event which had a greater influence than any other upon his character and future course." Isn't it wonderful to note that a boy of 12 to 15 is free to think without the bombardment of noise, of rock music, of tampering with drugs, or the bombardment of television? I am certain that sons of God and light bearers today of that age may very well have ingenious ideas passing through their minds, but they do just that. They often pass through because there is too much debris. It was as if there was room for an echo in this age of Francis Bacon, for the word of God within his mind to echo and return to him as a practical reality. It gives us pause to consider If another Francis Bacon has already been lost to this culture and generation, and it gives us pause to consider how the great silences and vastnesses of the inner retreat can provide room to think for children with minds such as these. From that moment there was awakened within his breast the appetite which cannot be satiated, and the passion which cannot commit excess. From that moment he had a vocation which employed and stimulated all the energies of his mind, gave a value to every vacant interval of time, an interest and significance to every random thought and casual accession of knowledge, an object to live for as wide as humanity, as immortal as the human race, an idea to live in, vast and lofty enough to fill the soul forever with religious and heroic aspirations. From that moment, though still subject to interruptions, disappointments, errors, regrets, he never could be without either work or hope or consolation. The simple idea that there is a better way, that we can figure out how to do it, and then we can do it. Bacon's plan to change the whole wide world crystallized into a scheme which he later called the Great Instauration. In it he proposed a renewal of art, science, literature, and ethics. This very concept, in essence, became the blueprint for the English Renaissance. His biographer, Alfred Dodd, asserts that Bacon labored at putting this plan into operation all his life, not only by writing books, but by the active establishment of organizations that would further his purpose. In 1576, at the age of 15, Francis left Cambridge without having received his diploma, and at the insistence of Sir Nicholas, embarked upon a law career at Gray's Inn. On September 20, 1576, Francis attended a birthday party given for Queen Elizabeth. The occasion proved to be the most trying of his life. In the middle of the party, Francis' cousin Robert Cecil spitefully whispered the secret of Mr. Francis' birth to the ladies of the court. The Queen, overhearing one of the maids-in-waiting, Lady Scales, repeating the story, seized the unfortunate girl and beat her furiously. Francis, who had accidentally walked into the room while the fracas was taking place, intervened, pleading with the Queen for the girl's life. The truth came pouring out of the Queen's own lips, and enraged that he should have taken the girl's side, she said to him, "Though you are my own child, I bar you from the succession for withstanding your mother." Shocked beyond tears, Francis ran home to York House, threw himself at Lady Anne's feet, and implored her to tell him the truth. Reluctantly, she unraveled the true account of his birth, admitting that the Queen would have had him killed had she not pleaded for his life. To soothe his pain, Francis wrote several sonnets to the Queen. Wrapped in mystery, they have never been quite understood by the literary community. When the Queen realized how uncomfortable the truth could be for her, she sent Francis to Europe in the care of Sir Amias Paulet, her ambassador to the French court. She needed some time in which to decide what to do about this incognito young prince of hers. She entrusted him with a mission to study cipher writing under the French experts, and to be trained in statesmanship by the French king, Henry III. It was at the French court that Bacon first felt the waves of the Renaissance which were sweeping across Europe. Here among the French literary circles, he learned the intricacies of ciphers, and it was here that he contacted the secret societies that had waged a relentless intellectual war against the Church of Rome from the time of Dante. He learned the art of secret writing, how to communicate through the open print by purposeful misprints, watermarks, hieroglyphics, headpieces, tailpieces, symbolic pictures, etc. He became saturated in the ancient mysteries, their rites, and their inner interpretation of the old world nature myths. He studied the works of the mysterious Pythagoras, learned the science of numbers and how to apply them to the printed word as a sacred seal. After 3 years of joyful living in Europe, Francis had a dream in which he saw the house of Sir Nicholas smeared with tar. Taking it as a warning of tragedy, he hurried home to England, arriving too late to see his beloved guardian again before he died. One of his admirers wrote of Francis at this period of his life, "When the passions fan out in most men, poetry flowers out in him. Old when a child, he seems to grow younger as he grows in years. Yet with all his wisdom, he is not too wise to be a dreamer of dreams." Upon his return to England, Francis attempted to pressure the Queen into formally acknowledging her responsibility for him. But she continually disowned her flesh and blood, denying him any offices under the crown. While Francis sought a paid position so that he could be financially self-supporting, the Queen and her ministers frowned upon his efforts to make himself independent, obviously afraid lest he attempt to secure his natural rights as a tutor. His financial wings closely clipped, he remained penniless, a genius financially dependent on the whim of the Queen. He once said, "I am like a hooded hawk that cannot fly, being tied to the Queen's fist." For the next 10 years, Francis struggled for a position in court, but was constantly disappointed. Finally relinquishing his design to rule over a material kingdom, he proclaimed, "I have taken all knowledge to be my province." Then, having made himself one-pointed in his mission, he began the birthing process of his plan for a world reformation which he called Instauration Magna, or the Great Instauration, and which initiated the long overdue English Renaissance. Francis Bacon became the herald of the scientific revolution. He introduced principles which might seem obvious to us, but which were quite revolutionary for the 16th century. Chief among these was the scientific method itself. The process is very simple. The scientist starts out with a premise and then, step by tedious step, through experimentation, he proves it. Our scientific community is still functioning on the simple concept of experimentation, using the induction method as Bacon taught it. By the time some of his philosophical works were in print, Francis Bacon had been appointed to a seat in the House of Commons, beginning a career of service which was characterized by both purity and popularity. During the 3 sessions of Parliament in which Francis Bacon served, England experienced some of her most important political victories, including the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. As one of its most outspoken members, Bacon championed the rights of the common man by advocating reforms of all kinds. He maintained that laws were made to protect the rights of the people and not to sustain lawyers, and that laws should be read by all and known to all. He was always striving to make England great, her people free, and prosperity to abound by sweeping away long-standing abuses and class privileges. He introduced bills that created much dissension and division among members of Parliament, bills which defended the plight of the common man against the long-standing injustices of the ruling classes within the court. And while he eventually wielded great power in the House of Commons, Bacon never once tipped his hat to the side of the forces of reaction or tyranny. No one at court could match his tongue of fire or the reverence he inspired in those who heard him speak. He had a soft voice, a laughing lip, and a melting heart which won him many friends. This incredible sense of justice was later to become his downfall politically, as his reform measures threatened some of the most renowned and powerful lawyers of his day. Even his cousin Robert Cecil, then Secretary of State, and Lord Burleigh, his uncle, were extremely jealous of the inner power Francis possessed. They knew it could lead him into a position of power at court, and ultimately, if he were to pursue it, even to the throne itself. Cecil's jealousy of Francis and his constant whispering about him to the Queen fortified her position against any reward of advancement for Francis. Upon the death of Elizabeth I on March 24, 1603, James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, succeeded to the English throne, becoming King James I of England. Francis tried to spark the heart and mind of James by sharing with him his philosophies concerning his vision of utopia. He dedicated his famous book, The Advancement of Learning, to the king, and even convinced him to become a brother Mason. When Francis married Alice Barnum, a woman many years younger than he, and a commoner at that, many people suspected that Francis was assuring James that Francis was not a rival for the throne of England, for no child born to a commoner could have become heir to the English throne. Unlike Elizabeth before him, James awarded Francis many offices at court, including Solicitor General, Clerk to the Star Chamber, Attorney General, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, Lord Chancellor, and Viscount St. Alban. The chancellorship was the highest office in the land, next to the king. At least one individual, however, was not so grateful for the wisdom of Francis Bacon. Sir Edward Coke, his fellow attorney in Parliament, watched Francis rise to power with dismay. Coke had detested Bacon from the day Francis entered the House of Commons as a young man. The two were in every way opposites. Coke was rich and powerful, 10 years older than Francis, a lawyer of repute with a ready, bitter tongue, a narrow mind that revolved exclusively around musty law tomes, and the miserly gratification of making and hoarding money. Francis was usually poor and penniless, a young idealistic barrister who loved literature above most things, whose only use for money was to spend it in the pursuit of wisdom and the upliftment of his fellows. He had, moreover, the mouth and heart of an ancient orator, not the mere logic chopping of some of his peers. Coke hated Francis for his genius. Coke's inferiority complex stirred in the presence of one who he intuitively recognized as his intellectual superior. And he hated him all the more, knowing Francis Bacon to actually have a prouder lineage as a Tudor prince than his own. While Coke was serving a post as Chief Justice and Bacon was Attorney General, a tremendous quarrel broke out between the two men on points of the law. A decision had to be made as to whether Francis Bacon, as Attorney General, had the legal right to stay a particular case until the Crown could give its defense, or whether Coke, as Chief Justice, could pronounce a verdict without this defense. Coke forced the issue before the king and his 12 judges. The court sided with Bacon, suspecting that Coke had called the case for hearing because he wanted to flout Francis Bacon in the exercise of his duties as attorney. James ordered the suspension of Chief Justice Coke. He then appointed a Crown Commission to read and revise Coke's reports. Sufficient offenses were discovered against Coke, frauds, contempts, and disobediences, to ensure a condemnation and a public trial. Distressed, Coke got on his knees before the Privy Council, where Bacon had already replaced him, and begged for mercy in being spared a public trial. Responding to his pleas, Francis wrote to the king in Coke's defense. Had it not been for Sir Edward Coke's reports, which though they may have some errors, some peremptory and extrajudicial resolutions more than are warranted, yet they contain infinite good decisions and rulings over cases. Thus, mercy was extended. Still, this was Francis Bacon's victory. When news of Coke's disgrace spread to the common people, they joked to one another, "The bacon has been too tough for the cook." Coke's humiliation so embittered him that he now lived but for one thing, the complete and final ruin of his adversary. He quickly began laying his plans for the demise of Francis Bacon. He became the ringleader of a group of men who united under a banner of hate, each with a personal reason, to see Bacon fall. Sir Lionel Cranfield, second in command in Parliament, became Coke's right-hand man in this conspiracy. Like his leader, he despised the virtues of Francis Bacon. But while Coke would be satisfied with Bacon's ruin, Cranfield had his eyes on Bacon's titles. George Villiers, the king's favorite because of his handsome face and figure, whom James had made Duke of Buckingham, hated Francis Bacon, although he often posed as his friend, because he coveted the chancellorship. Reverend John Williams, chaplain to Bacon's predecessor, believed that the chancellorship should belong to the clergy, as it had in the past. Seeking this office for himself, he joined ranks with a conspiracy to oust Francis Bacon from the chancellorship. Then there was John Churchill, a crooked lawyer of the Chancery Court, infamous for forging Chancery orders. Bacon, who presided over the Chancery Court, happened to detect him in an act of forgery. Churchill could have been prosecuted, fined, and imprisoned for this offense. But Bacon was merciful and simply dismissed him. Churchill vowed vengeance upon the Chancellor for his dismissal. Resolving not to sink alone, he flew to Sir Edward Coke for help. John Churchill became the key to Coke's conspiracy. Realizing that because of his position in the Chancery Court, Churchill knew the face and name of every disappointed suitor, every dupe that had been hurt by law or who thought he had been, a bargain was speedily struck between the two men. If Churchill could produce evidence of corruption in the Court of Chancery, Coke pledged him restoration to his former position if by this evidence Francis Bacon was ruined. In each case, these disappointed suitors could not accept the justice of their own judgment or the mercy of Francis Bacon. They hated him for his mercy, because mercy is a quality of his Christhood, his genius, his guardian angel. It is easy to see that these individuals were the serpent class, the bastard sons, who could not take the chastening of the Lord through the master, Francis Bacon. Thus they conspired against him, even as others had conspired against Jesus Christ, against Thomas More, and others of the great lights of history. Coke's first blow as Parliament returned to session in January of 1621 was to move for a committee to investigate the grievances of monopolies. A report was prepared by Coke, who because of the momentum of his moves against the crown had become the accredited leader of the House of Commons. Coke met his hated rival face to face before the entire British Parliament and recounted his list of the Crown's abuses concerning patents. He twisted the facts to make it appear as though Francis Bacon alone was responsible for the abuses of the Crown, even while it was apparent that one of the patents which had been most abused had actually been sealed with the King's own hand. Yet the King joined Coke's choir in placing the guilt upon Bacon's head, stating, I am not guilty of those grievances which are now discovered. I grounded my judgment upon others who have misled me. On this premise, Coke arranged for another committee to investigate the abuses of the courts of justice with particular reference to the Court of Chancery, the court over which Bacon presided. While some members of Parliament questioned whether they had any power over the King's court, Bacon responded that as far as he was concerned, they had full leave to make any search into his court. Law reform had, after all, been Bacon's theme for many years. Without the actual consent of the Lord Chancellor, Coke could not have moved one step. This was the opportunity the conspirators were waiting for. And Francis Bacon gave them the full opportunity to outplay their hand and their identity. In fact, Bacon's first speech, after taking his seat in the Chancery in 1617, had contained a proposal for the removal of all abuses, such as fees, gifts, and presents connected with lawsuits. John Churchill, the corrupt Chancery official who had been dismissed by Francis Bacon, had in the meantime been employed by Coke to search for discontented litigants to lay complaints. Finding some eager to get even with their judge, he had his lists prepared with dossiers of details, which Coke had in his pocket, ready to produce at the right moment. Suddenly the storm broke upon Bacon's head. Coke and Cranfield presented their list of alleged briberies accepted by Francis Bacon in the execution of his office as Lord Chancellor. Bacon was taken totally by surprise, as were the other members of Parliament who had always respected the integrity of the man and his office. Bacon, in his first 4 terms, had made 8,798 orders and decrees, and freed more than 35,000 suitors in his court from the law's uncertainty. Scarcely one of Bacon's decisions had ever been reversed. In his determination to defend his good name, Francis responded to the charges. I know I have clean hands and a clean heart, and I hope a clean house for friends and servants. But Job himself, or whosoever was the justest judge, by such hunting for matters against him as hath been used against me, may for a time seem foul, especially in a time when greatness is the mark and accusation is the game. I praise God for it. I never took a penny for any benefice or ecclesiastical living. I never took a penny for releasing anything I stopped at the seal. I never took a penny for commission of things of that nature. I never shared with any servant for any second or inferior profit. The Chancellor had meanwhile taken ill and had to remain at home in bed during the court proceedings. We surely understand this to be the momentum of criticism, condemnation, and judgment directed against him by these vicious individuals. Therefore, from his bed, he wrote to the king, I have been no avaricious oppressor of the people. I have been no haughty or intolerable or hateful man in my conversation and carriage. And for the briberies and gifts wherewith I am charged, when the books of hearts shall be opened, I hope I shall not be found to have the troubled fountain of a corrupt heart, in a depraved habit of taking rewards to pervert justice, howsoever frail I may be, and partake of the abuses of the times. Bacon then asked for an opportunity to defend himself before the court. The remaining account is based on Francis' own records of the passing events, written by a biographer. He writes the peers asking them to suspend judgment until he can call his own witnesses, produce rebutting evidence, instruct counsel, until he knows the definite charges, is fit to attend to details. He asks for permission to cross-examine and the usual legal privileges attendant on a high court action. Though ill, he makes active preparation for the defense, knowing that he has clean hands and a pure heart, and can riddle the charges. Unknown to him, the charges accumulate. There are 22 in all, expanding to 28 counts. The king becomes alarmed. The temper of the House of Commons is such that he knows if the Chancellor be acquitted, the House will turn on his favorite, and probably himself, with disastrous consequences. Coward as he is, he seeks the advice of the cleric John Williams, one of the conspirators who covets the Chancellor's office. He and Buckingham urge the king to ask Lord St. Alban to abandon his defense, to plead guilty in general terms, suggesting that the king could extend his prerogative to later annul whatever sentence was passed by a full pardon. Their advice is to command Lord St. Alban as the king, if necessary, to submit to his will and to plead guilty. The king, full of fears of red ruin and revolution, sees the Lord Chancellor. He begs and implores him to submit lest the throne be jeopardized. He makes all sorts of specious promises. At last, as king to servant, he commands him to enter a general plea of guilty to the charges. The Lord Chancellor submits. From his point of view, the king in his office as king can do no wrong. He has therefore no free personal choice. The king carries his submission of guilt to the House of Lords, where it is announced by the Prince of Wales. The Lords are stunned at the bare news. For many minutes there is a dead silence. But the Buckingham, Coke, Cranfield gang, armed with foreknowledge, have laid their plans. Their enemy is helplessly in the trap. Their friends in the upper house, to humiliate him, demand that he pleads guilty to each particular charge. There is no way of escape. He cannot draw back. He receives the details for the first time. He writes guilty and leaves his notes on each case. Coke presses that he should be executed and talks of precedents to justify such an act. Bacon is, however, fined, imprisoned, and stripped of his office. While imprisoned in the Tower, Francis wrote to the king for mercy. I was the justest chancellor that hath been in the 5 changes since my father's time. And when he was finally released from prison, he wrote again. I humbly thank your majesty for my liberty, without which timely grant any further grace would have come too late. But your majesty that did shed tears in the beginning of my trouble, will, I hope, shed the dew of your grace and goodness upon me in the end. Let me live to serve you, else life is but the shadow of death. To your majesty's most devoted servant, Frater St. Alban. Francis Bacon considered himself a living sacrifice upon the altar of human need. 3 years after the House of Commons sacrificed its own, the chief reformer of the age, an act of conciliation was granted by the king, and Bacon was reinstated with all his honors and privileges as a peer of the realm. All charges of bribery were officially dropped. At home with his friends and family, Francis was received not as a man vanquished and disgraced, but as one magnificently victorious. They rallied around him, each perceiving according to his capacity the brightness of the light that shone within. At Gorhambury he turned again to his studies. He wrote his history of Henry VII and dedicated it to Buckingham. Many other books were quickly edited and published, including his famous Novum Organum. The innermost circle of his literary group gathered continually about him. Richard Ince describes them. Toby Matthew, Sir Thomas Muties, most loving and most loyal of all his friends. Lancelot Andrews, whose feelings for Francis had deepened and mellowed now into a reverence that often brought tears to his clear gray eyes. And many younger men, John Selden, John Donne, George Herbert, they felt that friendship had undergone a new birth. They divined something of the height and depth of his sacrifice, of the fire through which he had passed, of the triumph, but not of this world which he had won. A top priority for Francis Bacon at this time of his life was the guiding of his literary group, which included some of the greatest intellects of the time. Those previously mentioned, plus Edmund Spenser, Sir Walter Raleigh, Francis Drake, and George Withers. Most of these were part of a secret society that Francis had formed many years earlier with his brother Anthony. The fledgling group had started as the Knights of the Helmet when the two were attending Cambridge. Its goal was to promote the advancement of learning. Francis was chosen at a very early age to be its leader. They adopted the ideals of the goddess of wisdom and built their order around the symbols of this mystical goddess. She was known as Minerva, Pallas, Pallas Athena, and Athena. She wore a helmet which was supposed to permit her to assume invisibility. The goddess of wisdom was also known as the patroness of the liberal arts and sciences. Her main symbols were the helmet, the staff at her side, the serpent at her feet, a shield, a looking glass or mirror, and an owl. The staff denoted knowledge or wisdom by which the serpent of ignorance at her feet was destroyed. The shield was used as a protection when warring against ignorance. The glass or mirror was a means of receiving and transmitting knowledge or wisdom by reflection. And the owl denoted secret wisdom. The small band of knights eventually grew into another group, the Fra Rosy Cross Society. The members of this group assumed invisibility even more than the previous circle had. They saw to it that all of their works were marked by code so that they might be identified by one another. Eventually, this group was transformed into two others, officially called the Fraternity of the Rose Cross and Freemasonry, respectively. The early Rosicrucians and Freemasons were all sworn to secrecy regarding Francis' true identity and the authorship of his many works, including some which were published under their own names. These men are believed to have collaborated on many of the works attributed to the English Renaissance period. The name Shakespeare has been associated with the statue of Pallas Athena, the goddess of wisdom and truth, as she was considered the patron of both the useful and the elegant arts. Athena was depicted in Greek art as holding the spear of knowledge in her right hand, poised to strike at the serpent of ignorance writhing under her foot, when the morning rays of the sun glinted on the weapon, causing it apparently to tremble. The common people were in the habit of saying, "Athena is shaking her spear again." She was thus known as the spear shaker, or the shaker of the spear. Such lyric beauty as are found in the plays of William Shakespeare could only have come from the greatest literary genius of the time, another mystery in the life of Francis Bacon. This flowering of culture, the culture of the mother of genius in the Renaissance, during the embodiment of Sir Francis Bacon establishes our understanding of his relationship to his master, to his teacher, to his guru, the great divine director. We understand how true is the teaching of the brotherhood, that wherever the Guru-Chela relationship is intact, wherever there is maintained that line to the ascended masters, to the Ancient of Days, there the one who is below can give birth to that which is above. It shows that wherever the Word is incarnate, there is the only and sole opportunity for the change of civilization. When you think of the deadness and the darkness of the Middle Ages, and that darkness having come upon mankind as the judgment of the rejection and the crucifixion of the Christ in Jesus, and you realize this dispensation that was given to Francis Bacon, to Christopher Columbus, to embody, to bring light to the Piscean age, to conclude that age, and to bring us to the point of the foundation of Aquarius. He was laying the foundation of Aquarius during the Piscean dispensation, its final quarter, even as Jesus himself, as David, and other incarnations, was laying the foundation for the Piscean age even before that age began with his birth. Now, as you know, Francis Bacon was not William Shakespeare. Many students confuse that, and they think that Francis Bacon was William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare was a separate and independent person by that name. He lived and died. Francis Bacon merely used his name and signed his name to his plays to conceal his own authorship. Through his brilliant mind, his unending creativity, and his understanding of the psychology of souls, Francis was able to inspire an entire company of men to work with him, recording act after act of the most entertaining and educational stories ever told. His intent in publishing these under fictitious authorship was to leave an open door for his radiant thoughts to reach the common man of England. A teaching on morals seen through the drama of life has more impact than words on a library shelf. Francis and his stories have been loved and cherished for centuries. On Easter Sunday, 1626, at the age of 65, Francis Bacon died to the world he knew and loved. His casket was buried at his request next to Lady Anne's grave in St. Michael's Church at St. Albans, Hertfordshire. Upon his death, scholars all over the world united to acclaim Francis Bacon the greatest poet who has ever lived. No less than 32 Latin eulogies were published by Dr. Raleigh, Bacon's chaplain. Dr. Raleigh suppressed many more eulogies than were published, lest they revealed too much of Bacon's real identity. And a very enigmatical utterance was made by Henry Oakley. Oakley said, "He is gone. The word suffices for our grief. That he is dead, we say not." Why all the mystery again surrounding Bacon? As we examine the details of his death more closely, we discover that each one of 4 different writers, contemporaries of Bacon writing on his death, assigns a different place for the event. One says that he died at the house of Lord Arundel at Highgate, another that it happened at the house of his friend Dr. Parry in London, a third that he died at the house of his cousin Sir Julius Caesar in Mushwell Hill, and a fourth that he died at the house of his physician Dr. Witherbourne. Not one of these authorities either confutes or confirms one another, and no one has actually claimed to have been with Francis when he died or to have seen his dead body. Long research through a collation of books and records has indicated that, in fact, Francis St. Alban did not really die in 1626. We may suspect instead that all those who reported on his death were in league with one another, each pledged to suppress the true location of their revered adept. When in 1626 Francis held a public funeral for himself, his intention was that he should die not of the flesh, but a philosophic death to the world. His friends helped arrange a feigned funeral in which an empty crypt was sealed in St. Michael's Church. It is said that Francis, dressed in the garb of an old woman, actually attended his own funeral. This is that seventh ray sense of humor. Goodbye, cruel world. Many years later, the crypt was opened. It was completely empty. Members of the secret societies of Europe believe that after his funeral, Francis banished himself forever from his beloved Emerald Isle. Disguised, he escaped to the continent of Europe, where he is believed to have lived for over 40 years under various fictitious names. Contemporary Baconians believe that Bacon continued to write and to publish works under those pen names, and that he also used the names of the famous writers who belonged to his literary group. The following sentiments are the expressions of Alfred Dodd, probably the biographer who most understands the soul behind the man, Francis Bacon. Lovers of Francis Bacon have been chipping away at the funeral urn, the tomb, to free the awakening spirit. The personality within is still veiled from common eyes that see not, and common ears that hear not. But to you that have vision, a sense of beauty, a love of truth, the stone which has hidden and sealed Francis Bacon will be rolled away at your sympathetic touch. From those dead ashes, a new creation will arise. He will be seen and walk and talk with you of the Via Dolorosa, of the stations of the cross, of Gethsemane, of Calvary. The great magician walks once more among the sons of men. Lord St. Alban, the founder and father of modern free and accepted or speculative masonry. Shakespeare, the lover of humanity. He will rewrite history. He will throw into confusion all the literary highbrows who have chattered so foolishly. He will dissolve fond myths, monuments, and shrines with the charm of an indulgent smile. He will live as Shakespeare, a personality to be loved in the hearts and minds of men forever. Equipped with this knowledge, you will be able to say with the authority of one of old, "He is not here, he is risen. Why seek ye the living among the dead?" Alfred Dodd, his beloved biographer. Well, we can speculate that Francis Bacon departed to the Rákóczi mansion in Hungary at some level, physical or beyond the physical, that he perfected his adeptship, made his ascension, and spent another 200 years in Europe as the Wonder Man, attempting to form the United States of Europe, back in court again, peerless, the master. He was seen to be leaving the court of Versailles, and all of a sudden, through one more door, and he was disappeared. All of the feats that he performed, which are very exciting reading, dedicated his heart in those centuries, the remainder of the 17th, 18th century. He was still seen in the 19th century, always appearing younger and younger. So the Wonder Man of Europe did not desire to take his ascension and go on to Elysian fields. He never became King of England. Yet he was the magician that gave a new birth to England, to America, and he wanted with all his heart to give that new birth to Europe. 2 centuries for an ascended master is a long, long time. Every second of those centuries can be spent in cosmos in an equivalency of 1,000,000 years. He confined himself to that arena. Everyone of European descent or every European student ought to realize how much the Master Saint Germain and his guru has cherished that land and its people, because they're the people of the prophet Samuel, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And there they re-embodied all over those nations to follow the new Atlantis to the new world, to follow the Ark of the Covenant that went to America precisely when Saint Germain discontinued struggling with Europe and turned his attention to form the United States of America. That turning point came in the hour of the French Revolution. We can well understand why. At that moment he moved on. Obviously, he had already been preparing the United States. He was there in all of the preparations that happened long before, decades before the French Revolution. So at the time of the French Revolution, he was in Versailles, he was throughout Europe, and he was right there with Washington. Obviously, the Wonder Man, the Ascended Master. How he has cherished God government on earth. And this dedication of Francis Bacon to the true mission of Jesus Christ is so clear. It's the Lord's Prayer. Jesus only had to say one line for Francis Bacon to spend 2,000 years embodying to make it happen. Let thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And how did he propose to do it? By God government and by alchemy. By the elixir of youth, by the universal panacea for curing all diseases, which obviously is the light of the sacred fire, the violet flame, the Holy Spirit. He desired to bring God's kingdom into manifestation within you and within me and within every nation. He certainly faced tyrants and serpents with the most amazing skill. You can see him looking through them as though they were glass bodies, beyond them to Almighty God, whose servant he was. Thomas More had the same respect for the king as Francis Bacon did. While the king was the king, they were the king's good servant. As More said, but God's first. I'm sure Francis Bacon bore that sentiment. We were at Gray's Inn in London, where Bacon had studied, and at the inn where More had studied. The inn means simply the school and the library. It's wonderful to go to places that have existed these hundreds of years, where these individuals have been so real, and how real they have been in our history, as many of us are also descendants of the British Isles. When you realize that what Saint Germain has been through and what he has tried to do has met with adversity every step of the way, you realize that his love is an incomparable love. A love so intense, so zealous, so far-reaching. When you think of the master of masters that he is, that he was already a master 70,000 years ago, and a priest of the sacred fire, when you think of all this and you realize he still stays to set us free, it is the most wondrous example we know, and that the Ascended Masters know, of a living person that is so tangible that we can see him in this very room, we can touch him. He is more physical than ourselves, more real, more concrete. He is a greater friend than any friend we ever know or have known. His mind is so vast that I feel almost as a beggar to even attempt to be his messenger, to think that he has to put up with my vessel to get across what he wants to get across. But you know, he doesn't have to stop with me. All of the marvelous advances in science and literature and culture that he has sparked can become your fort. And you can become spokesman for Saint Germain in a very detailed way through the technology which his scientific method has brought through. I think we should all dedicate ourselves to be spokesman for Saint Germain, for he has so many, many, many talents and ideas in every field of human advancement that even with all of us, he may not get it all said. So I know the fervor of your heart's love for Saint Germain has brought you here before you even knew the name of Saint Germain, because he is the spearhead of the Great White Brotherhood's movement. It is his life that is laid on the line for you, and he is the one that bears your karma and has made the sacrifices, with El Moria and all the rest supporting him. So it's a wonderful thing to have a little more insight into the life of Francis Bacon. Not so much to know that he suffered a conspiracy and betrayal, but to know how he faced it. It did not change his attitude toward God and man. No reaction against the king, the scoundrel that was in his place. No reaction against the rest. He moved on to set forth the teachings of his heart in writing.